You know, I used to think horror stories were just stories, things you'd tell around a campfire or on Halloween to give yourself a scare. But after what happened to me at St. Vincent's Hospital, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in one again. I still get chills when I think about it. It was last winter, and I'd been admitted to the hospital for a minor surgery. Something routine, they said. I remember the nurses being kind, the doctors efficient, and the atmosphere oddly calm for a place that was supposed to be bustling with life and death at every turn. But that calmness, it didn't feel right. It felt forced, like the hospital was trying too hard to hide something. My room was on the 4th floor, room 413. Even saying the number now makes my stomach twist. It was a single room, which I thought was a blessing at first. No roommates to disturb me, no noise, just peace and quiet while I recovered. But that quiet soon became suffocating. The first night was uneventful, mostly. The nurses came in and out to check my vitals. I dozed off to the hum of the machines. Around 3 a.m., though, I woke up feeling strange. Not sick, just uneasy, like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to post-surgery nerves and closed my eyes again. Then I heard it. A soft knock. Not on the door, but on the wall next to my bed. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I pressed the call button for the nurse, but no one came. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe the building settling or something like that. But the knocking came again, louder this time. I sat up, my heart pounding. The room was dimly lit, with just the glow from the hallway light filtering in through the cracked door. I stared at the wall where the sound had come from, but there was nothing. Just a plain, beige wall. And then I saw it. A shadow. It slid across the wall, slow and deliberate, even though there was no one in the room to cast it. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I whispered. The shadow stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then it started moving again, toward me. I screamed, hitting the call button over and over. The shadow vanished just as the nurse burst in, her face pale with concern. What's wrong?" she asked, rushing to my side. There was something, I stammered, pointing at the wall. She looked at me like I was delirious, muttered something about medication side effects, and left after calming me down. But I knew what I'd seen. That shadow wasn't in my head. The next day, I asked about the history of the hospital, trying to make sense of what had happened. One of the older nurses hesitated before telling me that room 413 was once part of the psychiatric ward. Patients with severe conditions used to be kept there. Some never left. "Did anyone die in this room?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The nurse gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Hospitals see their fair share of death, sweetheart," she said before walking away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on, but it didn't help. Around midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air, and the machines began to beep erratically. I hit the call button again, but this time, no one came. The hallway outside was eerily silent. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves, but soon I could make out words. "Get out! Why are you here? Leave!" The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop, and then the bed started to shake. I grabbed the rails, my heart racing. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the light. Tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold and angry. "Who are you?" I screamed. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. I scrambled out of bed, pulling my IV stand with me. My legs were weak, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. As I reached the door, it slammed shut in my face. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The figure was closer now, just a few feet away. I could see its face, or what was left of it. Pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew it was morning, and the nurses were hovering over me, their faces etched with concern. "You had a panic attack," one of them said. "You're being transferred to another room." I didn't argue. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I just wanted to get as far away from room 413 as possible. Before I left, I saw something that still haunts me. Etched into the wall above the bed, faint but unmistakable, were the words, "Leave." I don't know what's in that room, and I don't want to know. But if you ever find yourself at St. Vincent's Hospital and they offer you room 413, do yourself a favor. Say no.
Story number 2.
I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. Or rather, I didn't. But there's something about St. Elizabeth's Hospital that defies logic. Something I can't explain no matter how hard I try. It started with a car accident. A bad one. I was on my way home from work when a truck ran a red light and plowed into my car. The next thing I knew, I was being rushed into the emergency room. Everything after that was a blur of pain and darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines. The room was small and dimly lit, with pale green walls that seemed to close in on me. I was alone, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a monitor beeping. A nurse came in to check on me, a cheerful woman with a kind smile. She told me I'd suffered some broken ribs and a concussion, but I was lucky to be alive. I nodded, grateful, though something about the room felt off. "Which room is this?" I asked. "Room 303, she replied. "You'll be here for a few days while we monitor you." Something about the way she said it, too quickly, too casually, made me uneasy. That night, I couldn't sleep. The painkillers dulled my aches, but my mind refused to settle. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside my door. I called out, "Hello?" The footsteps stopped. "Is someone there?" No answer. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I tried to tell myself it was just a nurse making rounds, but something about the sound, those deliberate, measured steps, didn't feel right. The next morning, I asked the nurse about it. She brushed it off, saying the night shift was always busy, and I probably just heard someone passing by. But the way her smile faltered told me she didn't believe her own words. That night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I felt it, a cold breeze brushing against my face. My window was closed and the door was shut. There was no reason for the room to be so cold, and then I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Help me." My eyes shot open. The room was empty, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, trembling with desperation. I pressed the call button for the nurse, but nothing happened. The button clicked, but no one came. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Help me." I sat up, my heart racing, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Her hair was matted and stringy, her hospital gown torn and stained with blood. Her eyes were wide and hollow, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "You have to help me." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stared, frozen in terror, as she took a step closer. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold tile floor. "They won't let me leave," she whispered. "They keep me here. Don't let them keep you too." Before I could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt her presence closer now, the air around me freezing. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and she was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled under the blanket, too scared to sleep. The next day, I demanded to be moved to another room. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, but finally agreed. As they wheeled me out, I caught a glimpse of the corner where the woman had stood. The wallpaper was peeling, and beneath it, I could just make out something scratched into the plaster. "Help me." My new room was brighter, more modern, and felt safer. But the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the image of that woman, her hollow eyes and desperate voice. I asked one of the older nurses about room 303, hoping for answers. She hesitated before finally speaking in a low voice. "Years ago, a patient died in that room," she said. "A young woman. She was brought in after a car accident, but there were complications. The staff tried to save her, but she didn't make it. Some say her spirit never left." I wanted to believe it was just a story, but the nurse's expression told me otherwise. "Did anyone else see her?" I asked. The nurse nodded reluctantly. "A few patients have reported strange things, whispers, cold spots, shadows, but the hospital doesn't like to talk about it. They say it's bad for business." Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my recovery, but the memories of that night haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. On my last night in the hospital, I woke up to find the lights flickering again. My heart sank, and I prayed it was just a power issue. But then I heard it, the same whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I turned my head slowly, and there she was, standing at the foot of my bed. "Why won't you help me?" she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I can't. I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know how." She stepped closer, her expression shifting from desperation to anger. "You have to help me," she said, her voice rising. "If you don't, they'll take you too." The air around me grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The next morning, I checked out of the hospital, barely able to contain my relief. As I left, I glanced back at the building, its gray facade looming over me like a specter. I don't know what she meant or who they were, but I pray I never find out. If you ever find yourself at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and they offer you room 303, do yourself a favor. Refuse. Some things are better left undisturbed.
Story number 3.
I'm not someone who scares easily, at least I didn't think I was. But something happened to me 2 years ago that still keeps me awake at night. It wasn't in some abandoned house or a haunted forest. No, this happened in the last place I thought I'd encounter anything sinister. A hospital. It all started when my grandmother fell and broke her hip. She was taken to Mercy Pines Hospital, a place that had been in our town for decades. Everyone knew about it, but not in a good way. People whispered about strange things happening there, but I always dismissed it as small-town superstition. Her surgery went well, and the doctors said she'd need a few nights to recover before going home. Since I lived nearby, I volunteered to stay with her. She was in room 712, at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway on the 7th floor. From the moment I stepped into that room, I felt uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense that the air was heavier there, thicker somehow. My grandmother noticed it too. "This room doesn't feel right," she whispered to me that first night. I laughed it off, telling her it was just her nerves after surgery. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The first night passed uneventfully. I stayed in a chair next to her bed, dozing off and on. But the second night was different. It started around 11 p.m. My grandmother had fallen asleep, and I was scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the radiator or some other old piece of hospital equipment, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't mechanical. It was coming from the corner of the room. I stood up and walked over, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But the moment I reached the corner, the tapping stopped. I shook it off and went back to my chair, but a few minutes later it started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my grandmother. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "What is it?" "The tapping," I said. "It's coming from the corner." She frowned, her face pale. "That's where he was standing." I froze. "Who?" "The man," she said, her voice trembling. "He was standing there earlier, just watching me. I thought he was a doctor, but his eyes weren't right." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "They were black," she whispered. "Completely black." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, but the fear in her eyes stopped me. That night, I barely slept. I kept my eyes on the corner, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But nothing happened, and by morning, I convinced myself it was just my grandmother's post-surgery delirium. The next night, though, everything changed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my grandmother whispering. "Stop," she murmured. "Please, leave me alone." I sat up, my heart pounding. "Grandma, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something above her bed. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. There was a figure standing there, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its head seemed to tilt at an impossible angle. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence suffocating. I reached for the call button, my hand shaking, but before I could press it, the figure vanished. My grandmother turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "He said he's waiting for me," she whispered. I didn't know what to do. I told the nurse about it the next morning, but she just gave me a polite smile and said patients often experienced vivid dreams after surgery. That night, I was determined to stay awake. I kept the lights on, hoping it would keep whatever it was at bay. But around midnight, the room grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Then the machines started acting up. My grandmother's heart monitor beeped erratically, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. I pressed the call button, but no one came. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "She's mine." I turned toward the sound and saw it again, the figure from the night before. This time, It was closer, standing at the foot of my grandmother's bed. "Leave her alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure turned its head toward me, its face still obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, piercing through me. "She's mine," it repeated, its voice echoing in my ears. I grabbed my grandmother's hand, tears streaming down my face. "You're not taking her," I screamed. The figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. But before it disappeared completely, it whispered one final word: "Soon." The lights flickered back to life, and the room felt normal again. But I knew what I'd seen was real. The next day, I demanded that my grandmother be moved to another room. The staff resisted at first, but I didn't care. I couldn't let her stay in room 7112. We were moved to the second floor, and thankfully, nothing else happened. But before we left the hospital, I did some digging. I asked one of the older nurses if anything strange had ever happened in room 712. She hesitated before finally telling me the truth. "Years ago, there was a man in that room," she said. "He was a patient in the psych ward, back when this hospital had one. He claimed he could see death coming for people. He'd point to a corner of the room and say, 'That's where it stands.'" "What happened to him?" I asked. "He killed himself," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Right there in that room." I felt sick, and no one thought to, I don't know, cleanse the room or something? The nurse shook her head. "Hospitals don't believe in things like that, but some of us, we know better." I haven't been back to Mercy Pines since. My grandmother recovered and moved in with us, but she still wakes up screaming some nights. Sometimes I wake up too, convinced I can hear that same guttural whisper in the darkness. She's mine. If you ever find yourself at Mercy Pines, stay away from room 712. Some things aren't meant to be understood.
Story number 4.
Hospitals have always unsettled me. Even before this happened, I hated the sterile smell, the eerie silence broken only by distant footsteps, and the way time seemed to stretch in a place where life and death were constant companions. But after what I experienced at Greystone General, I know that my fear wasn't irrational. It was a warning. It started when I broke my ankle. Nothing dramatic, just a stupid slip on black ice outside my apartment. I was rushed to Greystone General, the only hospital nearby. I didn't think twice about going there, even though the place had a reputation. Greystone had been built in the early 1900s and expanded over the decades, but parts of the original structure still remained. They called it the East Wing, though no one went there anymore. Patients weren't admitted to that section, and the staff avoided talking about it. My room was on the third floor of the newer wing. It wasn't too bad, small, clean, and close to the nurse's station. I figured I'd be in and out in a day or two. But from the moment I arrived, things felt wrong. That first night, I couldn't sleep. My leg throbbed, the painkillers barely taking the edge off. The hallway outside my room was quiet, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that made you strain your ears for any sound, just to prove you weren't alone. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I sat up, my heart pounding. The door to my room was slightly ajar, and through the gap I saw something move. It was a shadow, tall and thin, and passing by my door. I held my breath, waiting for it to continue down the hall, but it didn't. Instead, it stopped just outside my room. I couldn't see anything, just the shadow stretching across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I reached for the call button, but before I could press it, the shadow moved. It didn't fade or retreat. It slid into my room, stretching along the wall like smoke. I froze, watching as the shadow gathered in the corner, growing darker and more solid. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. A face. Pale, gaunt, and lifeless. The eyes were black voids staring directly at me. I screamed, slamming my hand on the call button. The shadow vanished, and a nurse rushed in seconds later. "What's wrong?" she asked, Slova, her voice calm but concerned. "There was someone in here," I stammered. "A man or something. It was right there." I pointed to the corner, but it was empty. The nurse glanced at me, her expression guarded. "You've had a rough day," she said gently. "Sometimes the mind plays tricks when you're in pain." I wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She knew something. The next day, I asked about the East Wing. A younger nurse told me it had been shut down decades ago, but she clammed up when I pressed her for details. Later, an older orderly let something slip. "They say the East Wing is cursed," he muttered, looking over his shoulder as if someone might overhear. "Back in the 40s, there was a fire. Patients trapped, staff panicked. A lot of people didn't make it out, and some say they never left. I laughed nervously. You're joking, right? He shook his head. You think I go over there for fun? Even the janitors won't clean that wing. Doors slam on their own, people hear whispers, and the shadow. My blood ran cold. What shadow? The orderly hesitated. They call him the Watcher. He's been seen all over the hospital, but he likes the East Wing best. Some say he's the spirit of a doctor who died in the fire. Others say he's something worse. But everyone agrees on one thing. If you see him, it's a bad sign. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on, the TV playing quietly in the background to drown out the silence. But around 3 a.m., the TV shut off. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead cutting out. I fumbled for the call button, but it wasn't working, and then I heard it. A whisper. Why are you here? It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. Who's there? I whispered, my voice shaking. The air in the room grew colder, and I felt a presence, something heavy and oppressive, pressing down on my chest. Why are you here? The voice repeated louder this time. I turned my head toward the corner, and there he was. The Watcher. He was taller than I'd remembered, his face gaunt and hollow, his black eyes fixed on me. He didn't move, but his presence filled the room, suffocating and inescapable. Leave, he said, his voice echoing in my ears. You don't belong here. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could do was stare as his shadow stretched across the floor, creeping toward my bed. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the TV blared to life. The next morning, I demanded to be discharged. I didn't care if my leg was in a cast or if the doctors thought I was crazy. I had to get out of that hospital. As I was leaving, I overheard two nurses talking near the elevator. Did you hear about the patient in room 410? One of them said. Yeah, the other replied. Her voice hushed. They found him this morning. Heart attack, but his face. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why it happened. But I know one thing for sure. Greystone General isn't just a hospital. It's a place where the past lingers, where shadows watch, and where you're never truly alone. If you ever find yourself there, stay far away from the East Wing.
Story number 5.
There are moments in life that cling to you, no matter how much time passes. Moments you can't explain, moments that haunt you even when the lights are on and the world feels safe. What happened to me at Ridgeview Medical Center is one of those moments. It was a cold, rainy night when my dad was rushed to the ER. He'd had a heart attack, and the paramedics barely managed to stabilize him on the way. My mom was beside herself, so I drove us to the hospital. Ridgeview wasn't our usual place. It was an older facility in the next town over, but it was the closest option. When we got there, the hospital was eerily quiet. The rain tapping against the windows was the only sound as we sat in the waiting room, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on everything. Hours passed, and finally a nurse came out to tell us Dad was stable, but needed to stay overnight for observation. They let us visit him briefly before sending us back to the waiting room. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to grab a coffee from the vending machine down the hall. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hospital felt wrong somehow, too still, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I was halfway back to the waiting room when I heard it, a faint whisper. Help me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The hallway was empty, and the sound didn't come from any particular direction. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing faintly. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, and hurried back to the waiting room. My mom was asleep in her chair, and I didn't want to wake her, so I sat down and tried to distract myself with my phone. But the whispers didn't stop. Every few minutes, I'd hear it again. Help me. Sometimes it was faint, barely audible, and other times it was clear, urgent. I kept looking around, but no one else seemed to notice. At one point, I saw a shadow move at the far end of the hall. It wasn't like a person walking by. It was faster, more fluid, darting across the wall and disappearing around a corner. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay seated. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything but what it felt like. By 4 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to take a walk, hoping to clear my head. I wandered the hallways, trying to avoid the eerily dark corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. As I turned a corner, I saw an elevator at the end of the hall. Its doors were open, the inside dimly lit. Something about it drew me in. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, but the elevator didn't move. Instead, the doors closed with a soft hiss and the lights flickered. That's when I noticed the buttons. They were different from the usual hospital elevator buttons. There were no floor numbers, just a single button labeled B. Curiosity and fear battled within me. I didn't press it, but as I stood there, the elevator began to move on its own, descending into what felt like an endless void. When the doors opened, I was met with a long, dimly lit hallway. The air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of mildew filled my nose. Something told me to stay in the elevator, to press the doors closed and go back upstairs. But I stepped out, my heart pounding. The hallway was lined with old, rusted gurneys and medical equipment. The walls were stained with water damage, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips, and then I saw her. A woman in a hospital gown, standing at the far end of the hallway. Her back was to me, her head tilted at an odd angle. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw her shoulders begin to tremble, as if she were crying. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned around slowly, and my blood ran cold. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile that stretched far too wide. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a guttural rasp. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." Before I could finish, she lunged toward me, moving impossibly fast. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the cracked tile floor. The hallway seemed endless, the elevator impossibly far away. Her raspy laughter echoed behind me, growing louder and more frantic. When I finally reached the elevator, I slammed the button repeatedly, praying the doors would close in time. As they slid shut, I saw her face inches from the gap, her black eyes boring into mine. The elevator jolted upward, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. When the doors opened, I was back on the third floor. The hallway was empty, and everything seemed normal again. I stumbled back to the waiting room, shaking and drenched in sweat. My mom woke up and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. The next morning, we were discharged, and I swore I'd never set foot in Ridgeview again. A week later, I tried to research the hospital's history. I found an old article about a nurse who had died there in the 1950s. She'd been accused of neglecting her patients and taking shortcuts that led to multiple deaths. After being fired, she'd hung herself in the hospital basement. The article mentioned that her spirit was said to linger, appearing to those who wandered where they shouldn't. I don't know if what I saw was her or something else entirely, but I'll never forget her face. And if you ever find yourself at Ridgeview Medical Center, heed this warning. Stay away from the basement.
Story number 6.
I never wanted to work the night shift at St. Augustine's Hospital. I was a new nurse, and the night shift was the only opening available. It didn't bother me at first. How bad could it be? But by the end of my first week, I knew I'd made a mistake. St. Augustine's was old, built in the late 1800s. Parts of the hospital had been modernized, but many of the original structures remained. The staff whispered about its history, fires, mysterious deaths, and a ward they'd closed decades ago after a nurse disappeared. I thought it was just workplace gossip until I experienced it for myself. It was my third night on duty when things started to happen. I was assigned to the fourth floor, which housed long-term patients in recovery. Most of them were elderly and quiet, so the nights were uneventful. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the nurse's station, finishing up some charts, when I heard it, a faint humming. At first, I thought it was one of the patients. I stood up and followed the sound down the dimly lit hallway, but as I got closer, it stopped. I checked on the rooms nearby, but everyone was asleep. The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I went back to my desk, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. But an hour later, it happened again. This time, the humming was clearer. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and melodic, coming from the end of the hallway near room 417. Room 417 had been empty since I'd started. I hesitated, debating whether to check it out, but my curiosity got the better of me. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the humming stopped. The room was empty, just as it should have been. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was a faint smell, like burned wood. I stepped inside, my heart racing. On the far wall, near the window, was an old wooden rocking chair. I'd never noticed it before, and it didn't belong in a hospital room. It looked ancient, its varnish cracked and faded. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. The chair was rocking, slowly, deliberately, as if someone had just been sitting in it. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The chair stopped abruptly, as if it had been caught in the act. I left the room, closing the door behind me, and rushed back to the nurse's station. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, I avoided room 417. I kept my head down and focused on my rounds, trying to ignore the lingering feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, one of the call lights went off. It was from room 417. My stomach dropped. I checked the patient list again, hoping I'd made a mistake, but I hadn't. The room was supposed to be empty. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the hall, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the door, it was open. The room was dark, but I could see the outline of the rocking chair in the corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The chair began to rock, slowly at first, then faster. I stepped back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I saw her. A woman was sitting in the chair, her face hidden by a curtain of long, dark hair. Her gown was old-fashioned, stained with something dark and crusty. She hummed softly, the same melody I'd heard the night before. "Ma'am?" I whispered, though I already knew she wasn't alive. She stopped humming and lifted her head. Her face was wrong. Her skin was ashen, her eyes hollow, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural, toothy grin. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice a guttural rasp. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb you." She stood, the rocking chair creaking as it stopped moving. "You don't belong here," she said, stepping toward me. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed at my desk, too terrified to move, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I told one of the older nurses what had happened. She looked at me, her face grim. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked. "Who?" I whispered. "The burned nurse," she said. Her name was Abigail. She worked here in the 1920s, back when the hospital had a psychiatric ward. There was a fire on the 4th floor, and she stayed behind to save her patients, but she never made it out. I felt a chill run down my spine. "They say she still haunts the floor," the nurse continued. "Sometimes she's kind, watching over patients. But if she doesn't like you..." She didn't finish the sentence, and she didn't have to. I couldn't bring myself to go back to work after that. I quit the next day, but I still dream about her sometimes. Abigail in her rocking chair, humming her eerie melody, waiting for me to return. If you ever find yourself at St. Augustine's, do yourself a favor. Stay far away from room 417.
Story number 7.
I've always been skeptical about the supernatural. Ghosts, curses, haunted places. They were just stories, myths to scare kids or spice up old history. At least that's what I believed until I started working at Ashridge Care Facility. The place was once a grand estate in the early 1900s, later converted into a hospital during World War II, and finally transformed into a long-term care home for the elderly. The building had been updated over the years, but its bones were still old. Creaking floors, heavy wooden doors, and dimly lit hallways that stretched farther than seemed possible. My first day was uneventful. I was assigned the night shift, which was fine by me. I liked the quiet, and I figured it would be easier to get to know the routine without the hustle of daytime activity. What I didn't realize was how empty the facility felt at night, how the darkness seemed to press against the windows, making the world outside disappear. It was my third night when things started to feel off. I was making my rounds, checking on patients, and ensuring everything was in order. Most of the residents were asleep, their breathing soft and steady. The only sound was the faint hum of the air vents. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint but distinct, coming from the east wing, the part of the building that had been closed off for years due to structural issues. No one was supposed to be there. I froze, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving steadily closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the hallway. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the old pipes or the wind outside. But as I turned to continue my rounds, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It moved quickly, darting into one of the patient rooms. My stomach knotted. No one should have been awake, let alone moving that fast. I approached the room cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was empty. The patient, Mr. Connolly, was sound asleep in his bed. Everything looked normal, but the air felt different, thicker, colder. I stepped back into the hallway, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe I was just tired, my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. A soft, faint whisper. Help me. The voice was coming from the end of the hallway near the entrance to the east wing. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to walk away, to ignore it. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I walked slowly toward the east wing, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of mildew filled my nose. The double doors leading to the east wing were padlocked, but the lock was old and rusted. It looked like it had been broken for years. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. The hallway was darker than the rest of the facility, the flickering overhead lights casting long, distorted shadows. Hello? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I walked deeper into the hallway, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The rooms here were empty, their doors ajar, revealing abandoned hospital beds and crumbling walls. Then I saw her, a woman in a hospital gown, standing at the far end of the hallway. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly to the side. Ma'am? I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Are you okay? She turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and black, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched far too wide. Help me, she said, her voice a guttural whisper. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. She started to move toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. Stay back, I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. But she didn't stop. As she drew closer, the air grew colder, and the smell of decay filled my nose. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit farther away with every step. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps quick and uneven, her whispers growing louder. Help me. Stay. Help me. I finally reached the double doors and slammed them shut behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the lock, securing it as quickly as I could. The whispers stopped and the air grew still. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. That was the last time I went near the east wing. The next day, I told one of the senior nurses what had happened. She gave me a knowing look and pulled me aside. You're not the first to see her, she said. They call her Eleanor. She was a patient here during the war, back when this place was a hospital. She died in the east wing during a fire, trapped and forgotten. Some say she's still looking for help. I quit the following week, but I'll never forget Eleanor, or the way she looked at me with those hollow eyes. If you ever find yourself at Ashridge Care Facility, do yourself a favor. Don't go near the east wing.
Story number 8.
I've always been fascinated by old places, the kind of buildings that hold history in their walls, where every creak of the floor feels like it has a story to tell. That fascination led me to the Thornwood Sanatorium. It had been abandoned for decades, left to decay on the edge of a forest in upstate New York. Once a tuberculosis hospital, it had closed its doors in the 1940s after a mysterious outbreak claimed the lives of nearly everyone inside, patients and staff alike. No one ever figured out what happened. My friends Sarah and I were urban explorers, and Thornwood had been on our list for years. When we finally got the chance to visit, it felt like an adventure. We didn't realize we were walking into something far darker than a crumbling building. We arrived at sunset, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The sanatorium loomed ahead of us, its stone facade cracked and weathered. Windows were broken, and vines crawled up the walls like skeletal fingers. Creepy, Sarah said, snapping a photo. Exactly why we're here, I replied with a nervous laugh. We climbed through a broken window and landed in what had once been the main lobby. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. The smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming. The first hour was uneventful. We explored the patient rooms, finding rusted bed frames and peeling wallpaper. Sarah took pictures while I poked around, trying to imagine what the place must have been like in its prime. Then we found the basement. The staircase leading down was narrow and steep, the kind of place you'd avoid if you had any sense. But curiosity won out, as it always did. The basement was colder than the rest of the building. The air felt heavy, and our footsteps echoed in the dark corridor. We used our flashlights to light the way, the beams cutting through the thick shadows. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. It was metal, heavy and covered in rust. A faded sign read, "Morgue. Classic," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We pushed the door open with some effort, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the air was even colder, biting at our skin. The room was small, with rows of metal drawers lining the walls. An old autopsy table sat in the center, its surface stained with something dark. "This is insane," Sarah whispered, her camera clicking. I didn't respond. My attention was on the far corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. "Did you see that?" I asked. "See what?" I trailed off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But then we heard it. A soft, scraping sound like nails on metal. Sarah froze, her camera lowering. "What was that?" The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from one of the drawers. We exchanged a look, both of us too scared to speak. "Should we?" Sarah started, but I was already moving toward the drawer. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The drawer slid open with a loud screech, revealing nothing. It was empty. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. I nodded, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us. We spun around, our flashlights trembling in our hands. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. The temperature in the room dropped even further, our breath visible in the dim light. Then the scraping sound started again, this time from multiple drawers. One by one, the metal drawers began to slide open, each movement accompanied by that awful grating noise. We backed against the wall, too terrified to move. The room was filled with the sound of metal on metal, the drawers opening and closing as if guided by invisible hands. And then the whispers started. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs, but they grew louder, overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. "Help us. Leave. Why are you here?" Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, but I didn't know how. The door was still stuck and the room felt alive, as if it were breathing around us. The whispers stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, its body contorted in unnatural angles. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow, and its mouth stretched into a grin that didn't belong on anything human. It moved toward us, its steps slow and deliberate. "Leave," it said, its voice a guttural rasp. We didn't need to be told twice. I lunged for the door, throwing all my weight against it. Sarah joined me, and with a loud crack, it finally gave way. We stumbled into the hallway and ran, not stopping until we were outside, gasping for air. The sun had set, and the forest around us was dark and silent. We didn't say a word as we climbed into the car and drove away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its twisted body and hollow eyes. The next day, I tried to find more information about Thornwood. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The morgue had been used during the outbreak to store the bodies of the dead. But when the hospital was abandoned, rumors spread about the experiments conducted there. Horrific procedures meant to cure tuberculosis. Many patients died not from the disease, but from the experiments, and some say their spirits never left. I don't know what we saw that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in Thornwood again.
Story number 9.
The last thing I wanted to do was take a night shift at Willow Creek Mental Asylum, but the extra cash was hard to pass up. The asylum had closed in the 1970s after a fire destroyed part of the East Wing, but its remaining structure had been converted into a small clinic and storage facility. Rumors of hauntings had circulated for years. Staff disappearing, whispers in empty hallways, shadows that moved where no one was standing. But I chalked it up to exaggeration. That night, I learned how wrong I was. It was a stormy evening when I clocked in. The rain beat against the windows, and thunder rumbled low in the distance. My job was simple: man the front desk and make sure the building was secure. The security system was outdated, and most of the building was off limits, sealed behind heavy steel doors. Around midnight, I started to feel it. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of something burning, wood maybe, or flesh, drifted through the room. I brushed it off as my imagination. The building creaked and groaned with the wind, but there was another sound beneath it, faint but distinct. It was a soft humming, almost like a lullaby. I stood up, straining to hear. The sound seemed to be coming from the East Wing, the part of the asylum that had been abandoned after the fire. My stomach twisted. I was the only person on duty, and no one should have been back there. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the hallway. The humming grew louder, echoing off the walls. It sounded like a woman's voice, low and melodic, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I walked slowly down the hallway, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The farther I went, the colder it became. My breath puffed out in white clouds and goosebumps prickled my skin. I reached the door to the east wing. A heavy steel barrier. It hadn't been opened in decades, but tonight it was ajar. The humming stopped. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity pushed me forward. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The east wing was a maze of long, dark hallways and crumbling rooms. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the cracked tiles. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice echoing in the silence. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway was a woman. She stood with her back to me, her head tilted to the side. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands, and her white gown was charred and stained with soot. "Ma'am?" I called out. She didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you okay?" She turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow black pits. Her lips were cracked and twisted into a grimace. "Help me," she whispered. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The woman stepped toward me, her bare feet scraping against the floor. Her movements were wrong, her limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. "Please," she rasped, her voice echoing with layers, as if a dozen people were speaking at once. I turned and ran, the sound of her dragging footsteps following close behind. The hallway seemed endless, the walls closing in around me. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I reached for the wall, feeling my way through the blackness, when I heard it. A guttural laugh, low and menacing. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "Help me," the voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. I bolted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The humming started again, louder this time, filling the air with its eerie melody. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me. I turned another corner and saw a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open, light spilling out into the darkness. Desperate, I ran toward it and burst through. The room was small and bare, with a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor was a charred outline of a body, the blackened remains burned into the tiles. The smell of smoke and burned flesh was overwhelming. Before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Then the whispers started. They came from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. "You shouldn't be here. Why did you come? Stay with us." The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The light in the room flickered, and the woman appeared again, standing in the corner. Her head was bowed, her hair covering her face. "Help me," she said, her voice a haunting wail. She lifted her head, and her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Burn with us," she whispered. The walls of the room erupted into flames, the heat searing my skin. The fire spread quickly, engulfing everything in its path. I screamed and stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The woman stepped closer, the flames licking at her gown. She reached out, her hand skeletal and charred, and touched my arm. Pain shot through me, white hot and unbearable. "Join us," she said, her voice echoing in my skull. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, lying on the wet grass as rain poured down around me. The building was dark and silent, the east wing untouched by fire. I quit that night. But the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, the smell of smoke lingering in the air, and in the shadows, I see her, the woman in the burned gown, waiting for me to return. If you ever hear about Willow Creek and think it might be fun to explore, don't. Some doors should stay closed and some places should be left forgotten.